Mr. Warwick, shall we start?
Absolutely.
Perfect, perfect. So, first, thank you so much for joining us. A very warm welcome. And hello, everyone who has joined us, and a very warm welcome to you all. Let's start the today's webinar session. It's on the supply chain resilience and what 2026 will demand, and a strategic roadmap for the global trade stability. We want to discuss about a whole lot of things here. So today's discussion would be about broadening our perspective on global trade and understanding how businesses can build stronger, more resilient supply chains in an increasingly volatile world. So let me introduce myself. I'm Ashutosh Bhardwaj. I manage the growth strategy and partnerships at Market Insight. And I work closely with leadership teams on data-driven GTM strategies. I build for them trade intelligence frameworks, and I enable the companies to be more faster and make more faster and confident decisions in the complex global markets today. So as we know, the disruptions today are no longer exceptions, they are the norm. And geopolitics, climate events, trade policy shifts, sanctions, logistics shocks, all these now overlap continuously. And when supply chains break, the cost is about to rise and production stalls and the trust as well. So that's why resilience is no longer optional today, it's strategic. And in this webinar today, we're going to explore about what supply chain resilience will look like by 2026 and how companies can anticipate the possible disruptions and not just react on them. And we will also see where the SMEs fit in reshaped global value chains. And simultaneously, we're going to talk a bit about the data credibility, the trade data, customs data that brings in early signals for the leaders and to separate the leaders from the laggards. So we're going to discuss about that as well. And we're going to also introduce we're going to also discuss about something about the potential of AI in this scenario. Okay. So to the audience, please share your questions. We're gonna see them in the chat section in the Q&A section, and then we're gonna address them after the webinar is completed, so that we will discuss about them. We will address them all the questions that you are sending. Okay. Let me introduce the speaker, our guest speaker to guide this discussion. I'm pleased to welcome Professor Warwick Powell, the chairman at Smart Trade Networks and author of China Trust and Digital Supply Chains. His work sits at the intersection of supply chains, geopolitics, and digital trust, exactly where today's risks and opportunities converge. So I am delighted to hand it over to Professor Warwick to kick off today's discussion. Sir, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Ashutosh, and good evening, good afternoon, and good morning to everybody, wherever you happen to be. If it's okay with you, I'd just like to share a slide deck, and that way it will help me keep in shape as we walk through, I guess, some of the ideas that I wanted to share with everybody, and open up a discussion as a result of that.
So, Mr. Warwick, the thing is that we have built some sections and some questions to discuss with you. Uh,
Okay,
as soon as I ask you questions, you can keep on
sure.
showing
You
your
can.
sharing your screen and adding more stuff to those questions and give us the facts and whatever you
Okay.
want to share, right?
Sure, no worries. I'm happy to go with the flow.
Yeah, so what we will
And
do is, we'll go section by section. We'll cover multiple things that
okay,
we just I talked about. And
okay,
once I ask you the question, then you can obviously open your deck and
okay.
show it to the audience as well, right?
Sounds like a plan to me.
Perfect, perfect, perfect.
All
So
right.
what we will do is we will move to the section number one, where we are discussing the new risk map of global supply chains.
Yep.
So as we know that risks are now emerging from political decisions, sanctions, tariffs, shipping corridors, regional conflicts, strategic dependencies. So the number one question for you, Mr. Warwick, is that in your view, which geopolitical shifts right now are most likely to impact the global supply chains in the 2026? And how should the companies, the organizations prepare and adapt to these changes?
Look, I think the first thing that organizations need to actually get their head around is how supply chains globally in 2026 are fundamentally different from the way that supply chains existed uh, in 1996. So in the course of the last 30 years, supply chains have fundamentally transformed from relatively linear systems to much more complex, multi-layered, multinodal, and embedded or nested systems. And unless you can understand that fundamental change in the shape or the contours of supply chain systems, then it's almost impossible to get a grasp on the kinds of risks that exist, but also importantly, understand the kinds of interventions that might be needed to enable enterprises to deal with the disturbances that they are experiencing and to also anticipate where disturbances are likely to occur. So that's really, I think, the first thing I would say. The second thing I would suggest is that once we understand supply chains as integrated systems, we actually start to realize that many of the disruption risks that come with supply chains are actually endogenous to the systems themselves. These aren't extraordinary events that happen from outside of the supply chain systems, but they are fundamentally part and parcel of the very nature of the systems themselves. Right? So the systems are interdependent. Um, uh, Disruptions are rarely confined to single firms or even single sectors. Okay. And it's important to gain greater visibility throughout the depth and the breadth of supply chains so that we can start to identify where systemic risks actually accumulate. And often systemic risks accumulate in places that might actually be initially a long way away from where you are, both geographically and also in terms of where you are positioned inside supply chain systems. So I think that that's the first thing to get our heads around is the interdependent nature of supply chain systems. Um, Now, the other thing about supply chain systems in that sense, Ashutosh, is the role of information in coordinating these systems and how information asymmetry and asynchrony can actually lead to compounding problems, right? So I often use language like cascading, propagation, amplification as ways of understanding how small disturbances within the system can actually lead to significant disturbances in other parts of the system. And those disturbances can manifest themselves in all sorts of ways. Typically, they are first felt through pricing changes as well as the availability of materials. So we need to start to think about pricing, not so much as unique market clearing artifacts, but in fact as network or system signals about issues within the system at large. So pricing actually carries information about what's going on upstream and downstream in a systematic way. Pricing is affected by lots of factors, by things like the energy price upstream, multiplied across numerous sites, labor costs across many jurisdictions, the capital costs that are shaped by financial conditions, etc., etc. So, holistic, systemic approaches to supply chains as nested networks of production and circulation. Once we get that, all of these other things that you've started touching on, the types of disturbances and risks, then able to be understood in terms of where they are likely to cause the greatest disturbances, or where you might be able to enable nodes within your network to absorb the disturbances.
Right, absolutely. So, Vivek, definitely the organizations must rethink the design now. They should move from single country dependency to multi-node sourcing. They should embed the geopolitical risk scoring into the supplier's evaluation and treat the compliance intelligence as continuous and not as a one-time annual way, right? And
Yeah.
just to provide some stats as well here, I have made some bullet points here that IMF projects the global growth at 3.3%, but we see the volatility is rising And the shifts from the free trade to regional and political trade blocks is accelerating. We are seeing friendshoring, nearshoring, and trusted partner sourcing are becoming the new standards. And events like the recent instability in Venezuela remind us that how energy and transport shocks ripple through the supply chains, right?
Well, and in fact, many of those responses are very typical responses if you had a linear view of supply chains. So things like friendshoring and reshoring are
Hmm.
actually responding to singular symptoms, and yet they don't actually understand the systemic nature of what they're doing. And what typically happens when these sorts of responses are now contemplated and implemented is that they may lead to a temporary relocation of risk, but they ultimately amplify systemic fragility, which has feedback loops on companies. So companies that act notionally in rational ways are actually causing further instabilities within their supply chain networks that have blowback or feedback effects on them in 3, 6, or 12 months' time. In
Yeah.
other words, you've got to be very careful about your singular or your individual actions because they actually have ripple effects that can come back and haunt you. So what we find, for example, in traditional supply chain risk management are responses like just-in-time inventory management, right? So it's been focused around cost optimization. We then have an approach that concentrates suppliers to reduce costs. We have geographic specializations. And of course, that leads to certain kinds of risks that become amplified under certain conditions, such as pandemics that lead to concerns about availability of medical supplies, face masks, etc. Or it could be geopolitical
Mm.
concerns about the blockages of supplies of certain kinds of materials. The response, of course, to that is to say, well, we need to have more manufacturing and storage. So we build inventories.
Yeah.
We then start to try to manufacture our own face mask, for example. We have approaches that focus on identifying supplier risks, country risks, logistics disruptions, and compliance and reputational exposure in the event of commercial disruptions. The problem with that is that that kind of approach actually doesn't help us understand and therefore deal with why it is that disruptions in one sector cascade to the next. Okay. How price shocks actually propagate
Hmm.
across entire production networks, not just in your sector or in an adjacent sector, but ultimately affect you. And why risk mitigation at a firm level, at a single enterprise level, can actually increase system fragility and at the same time generate blowback effects, as I said. So we've actually got to have a very different approach to how we diagnose these sorts of issues, right? And if the responses are just on things like reshoring, friendshoring, I can guarantee you now that they will lead to increased costs that don't
Hmm.
necessarily resolve system fragilities. I
Hmm.
can guarantee you, for example, that in 5 years' time, countries and companies will have stock in inventory that is now past its use by date because they responded singularly to an historic event without any sense of what the ripple consequences are. And of course, there are opportunity costs. So when you commit time and effort to doing a certain kind of thing, it means you don't have that time and effort and resource to do other things. And often it's actually the other things that go towards stabilizing supply chain networks and ultimately enabling the participants in those supply chains to better mitigate risks and manage fragilities. What we're after in the end is supply chain resilience, right? Not enterprise response in the short term. Enterprise responses in the short term can often undermine supply chain resilience.
Yeah.
So the trick now, the challenge for enterprises and policymakers is to actually think beyond a single enterprise and understand that an enterprise is nested as part of an integrated network where an enterprise's interests and risks are fundamentally
Mhm.
tied to the dynamics of the system at large.
Right. Perfect. So with this, let's move to our section two, which basically discusses about the roadmap to building a resilient supply chain, which we have
Yep.
already discussed a few points about them. But the question that would arise here in the section two would be that to Mr. Vovik, to you is that what do you think are the opportunities for the SME development in a
Yep.
reshaped trade landscape?
All right. So we need to understand the kinds of risks that we have. Okay. You have on your screen there geopolitical risk.
Mm-hmm.
We can add in there a number of other kinds of risks, right? And one of those is, again, it's understanding how the system works. So we need to think about risks in terms of not only the probability of certain things happening, but where and when they happen within the system. Because where and when they happen within a system will affect the extent to which they might amplify. We need to understand what the amplification mechanisms are, because intervention in terms of addressing the
Mm-hmm.
risks around amplification requires understanding what those mechanisms are. You might not actually be able to deal with the risk itself. What you've got to do is work out how you contain its amplification. And so we need to think about mechanisms such as addressing information delays.
Yeah.
Because one of the things that we know is that delays in information between actors within a supply chain network can lead to a cascading accumulation of risk and bad decision making that ultimately causes greater network disturbance than is warranted. And we know this because in system dynamic research, you can have an environment where even though you might have stable demand, known future stable demand, upstream, you can
Mm-hmm.
actually have an incredibly dynamic and arguably chaotic environment. And it's because of information delays. Okay. So that's the first thing we need to bear in mind. The second thing we need to be thinking about is this idea of local optimization versus network effects,
Mm-hmm.
right? So whenever a single enterprise is thinking about its own local optimization, it actually needs to ask the next question, which is, how is this decision going to affect the stability
Yeah.
of the network as a whole?
Right.
Because if everybody acts in their own best interests, it does not necessarily follow that the network's interests are optimized. And if the network's interests aren't optimized, you're actually shooting yourself in the foot. We also need to understand locations where things like production time lags are more prevalent than at other points in the system. So there are certain kinds of inputs and output mechanisms within networks that are more flexible than others. And some and where you have amplification risk are in places where production systems can't be ramped up or can't be time managed, right?
Mm-hmm.
So they become bottlenecks within the system at large. And they might be at tier three, tier four, tier five.
Yeah.
And understanding how that works matters. And of course, we need to start to think about how a rational, localized response to with things like risk buffers may actually lead to cumulative increased volatility. Okay. So that's the first thing. The second thing is we need to then delve into these issues of risk,
Mm-hmm.
material risks, right? So a supply chain, of course, involves the movement and transformation of materials, particularly obviously when you're making things. But even in services-based supply chains, they also rely on materials too, whether it's computers or buildings where you do things or handouts or what have you. So even in a services environment, materials are nonetheless very important. We need to understand that what happens downstream is a function of what happens upstream. We need to understand that, in fact, many of the issues that we face are conditional on issues that are outside of our direct control. Right? So that's the second thing we need to understand. The third thing we need to understand um, is this question of price. Okay, so price is often treated as a market phenomenon, right? So mainstream economics will tell you that price is what clears markets. And if there are movements in price, your strategy is to hedge, absorb price increases, or pass them on. Well, that's what single enterprises do. But from a system perspective, price movements are actually bottlenecks. Um, it can tell us that there are disruptions upstream in terms of energy costs that are outside of your immediate control. All right. So again, we need to understand the types of risks and notice how these risks are not necessarily related to big single events. They can be very localized events a long way away that cause amplified ripple effects. Then we have regulatory risks, where geopolitics, of course, cuts across, where rules are changed and new rules are introduced that aim to change behaviors and modify incentive signals. Now, what's important about regulatory issues is not only your ability to respond, but when you think again of system risks and the challenges of having stable global supply chains, the issue is to ensure that regulations across jurisdictions are harmonized. Because when they aren't and when they are fragmented, you have significant problems around information and response, right? So you have divergent compliance requirements, we have asynchronous policy timelines, and of course we have this, conflicting disclosure standards and compliance standards. So these lead to increased coordination costs and delayed decision making. And the minute you get delayed decision making, you kick off the risks of cascading
Hmm.
time lag effects on the rest of the supply chain. And don't forget, if you affect your downstream and you start to affect the liquidity of your downstream, that liquidity constraint that you've caused will actually work its way back upstream because
Right.
the downstream needs liquidity to pay upstream.
Yeah.
Okay. Right. So that's the fourth dimension, which is financial risk. Understanding that financial dynamics is the feedback mechanism that flows in the other direction in response to the movement of goods and the movement of information. Okay. Now, all of this is tied together by a common thread.
Hmm.
And that common thread is limitations to system visibility.
Right.
Okay. So the most important challenge in terms of supply chain resilience is for actors in a supply chain to think about what they need to do to enhance system visibility, not only for themselves, but in fact for the system at large. Because without dealing with this issue of system visibility, those other issues that I've just described are actually invisible. And if they are invisible, you are trapped in a situation where you can only respond in a reactive manner. Okay. So the first response actually to today's dynamic environment is to enhance system visibility.
Right. So the next question that Mr. Warwick is that how important is the data credibility in helping SMEs move from being unknown suppliers to trusted trade partners? Right now, the data credibility, how it helps SMEs.
Well, yeah, look, it's absolutely central, actually. As I was saying, firstly, there's the issue of system visibility, and that's all about data. Okay.
Hmm.
The other issue, of course, for SMEs to participate in supply chains is to be in a position to secure insurance. Okay.
Yeah.
So for an SME to secure insurance, insurance is a data business, all sorts of data, but an SME needs to have the data ready at hand so that they are in a position to secure insurance. And when insurance is secured, an SME is in a better position to secure advantageous financing, right? Financing becomes difficult if there's no insurance. Who is going to finance supply chains
Yeah.
with trade finance and trade credit if there is no insurance to back it up? Okay, so data is important for those three things: system visibility, insurance, and financing. Okay. Now, the next thing we then need to understand in terms of data is the need to address this issue of symmetry and synchrony. Okay, so symmetry is the idea of parties having an equal position in terms of the relevant bodies of information. Synchrony is the issue about the timeliness of knowing something. And minimizing time lags in supply chains is a critical ingredient to addressing the risks, the cascading risks that I talked about. And so addressing this issue of information asymmetry and asynchrony is actually central to enabling small and medium enterprises to participate in supply chains and to contribute to the resilience of the supply chain networks themselves. Because if they can't provide the relevant data, which is an
Mm-hmm.
area obviously that you're very focused on and expert in, and that data is not in a format that satisfies the credibility requirements of the system at large, in other words, it's not data, it's just noise,
Yeah.
then the SME is unable to become a participant within that network and they can't participate. SMEs that are unable to provide timely information or receive timely information are also a problem in the network. They're a problem for themselves, but they are also a problem for the network. So information and data isn't just a question for individual enterprises. It's
Mm-hmm.
actually a challenge for the supply chain network at large. And
Right.
by addressing these issues of information and information asymmetry, enterprises are able to better manage inventory buffers. They are able to have more streamlined pricing that
Mm-hmm.
doesn't include as large a risk premium, right? Because
Right.
there's better network information, which
Mm-hmm.
makes them more competitive. So competitiveness isn't a function of a single enterprise. Competitiveness is a function of the supply chain as a whole. It will also enable enterprises in the network to make more timely investment decisions that are better coordinated.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and ultimately, from a policy perspective, if you're in the business of industry policy, regional economic development, and what have you, then information symmetry and synchrony helps you um, minimize the risk of policy interventions misfiring. Okay. And so we need to deal with this issue of data, the right data, data validity, and then data availability in a symmetric and synchronous manner.
Absolutely, I agree with you, Avik. The SMEs today, who have the verifiable trade footprints, they are facing fewer audits and delays. They are building buyer confidence at scale. They are being evaluated on real trade behavior, not just certificates. And they are securing repeated orders and long-term partnerships. So,
Correct.
as we were discussing about the credibility of data, the next section that we want to cover is data which acts as a resilience multiplier. So as we know that disruptions are becoming faster, more complex, organizations needs the ability to see risks early and understand the dependencies, respond with speed and precision. So data acts as a true resilience multiplier, and that's why we are covering this. So the question
Yep.
that arises is that why do you think, Mr. Warwick, that visibility into tier two and the tier three buyer suppliers layers increasingly dependent on customs and shipment data, and how critical is this for the current scenario?
It's absolutely critical.
Okay.
The risks that exist, if enterprises think that the issues that they face and the challenges that they face can be dealt with simply by having, strong visibility and relationships with their tier one suppliers, then they are seriously mistaken. Okay, because what you find is actually um, uh, often a misdiagnosis of the nature of the supply chains and the nature of the risks themselves. Um, if your entire focus is on tier one,
Hmm.
your response to a supply disruption may be to simply think you can change supplier. Okay,
Yeah.
so you're looking for a new supplier.
Hmm.
What you don't understand is that the supplier network actually sources something from a tier two or a tier three
Raw
that is actually
materials.
from a highly concentrated market.
Yeah.
Okay. And if that's not even visible to you, changing suppliers won't change anything.
Right.
because your suppliers have the same constraints. And this is what I mean by the systematic problems, right? So you've got to actually understand the entire configuration of your supply
Mm-hmm.
chain exposure. And by doing that, you actually start to understand where which points in that system, that web, actually is an amplification point, a risk amplification point, and which point can be a risk absorbing point. Okay, right. So an amplification point, for example, is one where the production system upstream is dependent upon single sources of things. Um, it's dependent upon electricity that is under short supply, is
Mm-hmm.
dependent upon a raw material input that is seasonal, is dependent upon a very particular kind of machinery that is temperamental, difficult to repair, hard to get spare parts for, or what have you. Right. So they're amplification points. Other amplification points, of course, is around uh, positions within these networks that control access,
Mm-hmm.
right? So these are regulated access points. In other words, where certifications matter, where compliance matter. Customs is a great one. Nodes in a supply chain where health certifications may be necessary is also a potential amplification point because when there is a bottleneck in amplification points, there's actually no way out. There are no alternatives. Okay. Right.
Yeah.
So you've got to understand amplification points and absorption points. Some enterprises actually have the ability to help the network absorb the punches, right?
Yeah.
So when punches come from upstream and from downstream and even exogenously, you need, and this is the resilience issue, you
Mm-hmm.
need a network that can, in a sense, absorb the impacts collectively, right? And if you because if you can't do that, and everybody acts only in their own narrowly defined short-term interests, the risk that they all have is that they destroy a critical component of their network that
Mm-hmm.
is difficult to replace, right?
Absolutely.
And so they end up in a supply chain environment where a critical link is no longer there because they actually undermine the viability of that operation themselves. And that operation, for example, may be a capital intensive, high volume, low margin activity. And they've destroyed that by trying to push price cuts into the low margin node within a supply chain system. And once that's gone, the capital costs of replacing that become too high. And that actually destroys the entire chain. Okay. So enterprises need to always think upstream and downstream. They
Right.
need to get beyond tier one. They need to get to
Yeah.
tier two.
Tier
They
two
need
and
to get
three.
to tier three.
Perfect, perfect. And to further add more to this point, uh, the growing structural threats to the global supply chain stability that make deep tier visibility no longer optional but essential. So,
Yeah.
some threats like geopolitics. So, a quick stat about it: 55% of the supply chain leaders rank this as the top risk currently. Conflict, sanctions, trade wars, hybrid warfare have turned the ports, canals, shipping lanes, and border crossings into systematic points of failure. And then the threat number two is the dependence on a particular country for a commodity like semiconductors. Taiwan produces around 60% of the global chips. So any disruption directly affects one third to 50% of the global trade routes. And the third is the maritime instability. So right now we see Red Sea disruptions have forced around nearly 40% of Asia Europe shipments through Africa, around Africa, and adding weeks of delay and major cost is increasing day by day, right? So the modern
Yep.
supply chains are currently wide, complex, deeply interconnected. So without the visibility beyond tier one suppliers, companies remain blind to hidden dependencies and concentrated risks, right? So I have been into this industry from almost now 9 years. This is where the shipment data, the customs data becomes indispensable that the market insight provides. Trade intelligence provides a real world transaction level view of how goods actually move across the borders. It uncovers the suppliers network. It uncovers all the trade routes, volume dependencies, and the disruption exposure that internal systems alone cannot detect, right? With the right trade data, the organization can anticipate disruptions and they can strengthen their supplier and logistics network, and they can make it faster, more confident decisions they can make. And that brings us to the fourth section. Actually, we have created a separate section for it. Mr. Warwick, the section number four, the question is
Yeah.
that how can trade data, now specifically talking about the trade database, how can the trade data reveal the hidden risks and strengthen the resilience across suppliers and logistics network? I already know you have covered a few points about it, but if you want to add something.
Yeah, sure. Look, I mean, trade data, of course, deals with where things happen and what those things are, right? And that's important. Um, we also need to start to think about the feedback financial flows, and we
Mhm.
also need to think about these nodes in terms of their ability to contribute to system visibility. Are they nodes, for example, that cause delays in information? Where is information itself experiencing bottlenecks? So not only are we interested in bottlenecks and blockages and risks in
Mhm.
physical infrastructure, but because of the centrality of information within supply chain risk management, we actually need to understand what the supply chain of data itself is
Yeah.
at a global level.
Mhm.
And that means understanding the complexity of the data environment. So trade data is a critical part of it because in a sense, when we're dealing with trade, that is the datum, right? It's the baseline information. So many containers of whatever it is left here, arrived there, um, got through customs.
Right.
Those sorts of information are important. Were there delays, right?
Yeah.
Was the and did the goods arrive in fit state?
Absolutely.
Ensuring, all those sorts of things are absolutely important. And I think what we need to be thinking now about is elevating this discussion around data
Mhm.
to pushing the thinking that we do and ultimately building the systems and solutions that address system data,
Yeah.
asynchrony, asymmetry, and visibility through multi-dimensional mapping, right? Because when we think about issues such as what people talk about as geopolitical risk, the
Mhm.
real question there, I mean, because geopolitics is in a sense an empty category, right? What exactly are we talking about? Well,
Mhm.
we're talking about decisions made by governments to
Yeah.
change a law, for example, that will either make something possible, make something impossible, or create new frictions for something to
Mhm.
happen, right? Now, the issue, of course, is if a small modification was made in something somewhere, what are the ramifications for other people within supply chain networks? But there are other dimensions of this issue of geopolitics, which isn't about governments changing rules, tariffs and all those sorts of things. They're actually about fundamental changes to how industrial structures work. So when we are now entering into a period of intensified militarization, we're going to see impacts on certain kinds of material supply chains
Mhm.
that will have spillover implications for unrelated supply chains. Um, a great example of that is actually cotton fiber, right? Cotton fiber is an important input in munitions, and there is a shortage already of cotton fiber. Now, as militarization ramps up and budgets are approved for the manufacture of more missiles and bullets and things like that, there will be an increase in price of cotton.
Mhm.
Now, if you're in the business of making shirts or in the business of running hotels and you need sheets and pillowcases and things,
Hmm.
the remilitarization of the world is actually going to make your input costs far more expensive,
Yeah.
right? Now, not only will it affect your business in terms of people traveling,
Hmm.
it'll actually affect your cost base.
Cost,
So
yeah.
it's a great example of how the ripple effects of uh, events in certain places and certain industries
Hmm.
actually have consequences right across the board. You touched on this issue of semiconductors, but it's not just semiconductors, it's what happens
Hmm.
upstream, right? It's not just about TSMC in Taiwan having supply problems, right? It's actually about whether or not they have access to sufficient inputs to do what they need to do. And what are the consequences, right? And the consequences are an increase in price of alternative chips from others like Samsung, right? And that then begins to affect other things, right? But the other thing that it could well do is that if it makes 2 nanometer and 3 nanometer semiconductors very expensive and difficult to get, it
Hmm.
will actually create a response in the semiconductor world and the users of semiconductors for more traditional semiconductor types. So instead of designing the next generation of household appliances that might use the more advanced semiconductors, we'll actually see a lot more household appliances made with cheaper, more abundant semiconductors, and that will change the supply chain again. And that will change the upstream, right? Because it will have a different demand profile for steel, for aluminium, for
Hmm.
plastics.
Right.
Um, we're going to see changes in the global demand for copper. Not only is it happening because of the changing needs of the electricity system in response to artificial intelligence, but it's also going to happen because we're going to have a changing materials availability in new high conductive materials, right, which will affect the market for copper.
Yeah.
Right? So all of these issues that have indirect implications ultimately can be understood if we've got the right data. Okay,
Absolutely. Absolutely.
so this data question needs to go beyond the linear. It needs
Hmm.
to go beyond the very traditional way in which we think about supply chains, and we actually need to start viewing supply chains as multi-dimensional, complex systems, and data then helps us understand the dynamics of systems.
Absolutely. Just to further add, trade intelligence, as we are talking about in this section, basically provides us, it shows us what's actually happening on the ground, who is trading with whom, the complete buyer supplier chain, from where they are trading, at what scale they are trading, and through which routes they are trading, right? So the market
Yep.
insight, our firm, we provide customs and trade information, and we have created platforms. Which organizations can use to discover the buyers backed by real shipment history. They can identify the reliable suppliers with proven consistency. They can spot the market opportunities using demand signals. They can track the competitors' sourcing strategy. And the trade data highlights the over dependence on single suppliers or single corridors. And early warning signs are provided. Volume drops and irregular shipments are highlighted. Logistics bottlenecks and politically sensitive routes are highlighted as well. So, embedding the trade intelligence into everyday decision making, organizations move from reacting to disruptions to building a proactive data driven supply chains resilience. So, that is what the importance of trade data is. And with respect to trade data, we will also discuss the hot topic today, which is AI. So that will we will move to the section number 5, and we will
Yep.
see what is the role of AI, its pivotal role in every sphere. So the question to you is that how do you think AI is going to forecast or to outperform traditional models, and why won't the legacy systems that were working would not work from 2026?
Well, it goes back to my opening remarks. We have a particular traditional mental model of supply
Mm-hmm.
chains and how we evaluate risks and the issues impacting them. Those models have a very linear view about supply chains as net or as a series of bilateral transactions.
Mm-hmm.
And what we need to do is shift the entire paradigm. Okay, we need to build off that foundation. It's a useful foundation, and actually shift the paradigm into complex system analytics. AI can help with that, of course, right? And the examples I'll give is, and again, this is about visibility. Um, uh, Interventions that some enterprises do. Um, uh, Such as diversification, right? So, a very typical response to a supply problem is to seek to diversify the supply chain. But
Mm-hmm.
as I touched on earlier, that actually may be a misguided move simply because the constraints in your supply environment isn't the fact that you have one supplier who is struggling. It's the fact that 3 layers away, there is a bottleneck around a raw material that has nothing to do with diversification at all. Diversifying actually can make things worse, and it can make things worse because you affect the financial flows of your upstream supplier, which actually undermines your interests in having a diverse supply base. We can, for instance, also see, if we have a linear view of the world, an increase in buffers, right, as a way of dealing with supply chain shocks. Now, of course, what that does is that it increases costs,
Mm-hmm.
and it can actually lead to further volatility, both upstream and downstream.
Yeah.
Because by increasing buffers, you're sending signals upstream that there's more demand, which leads to upstream activities to meet that increased buffer stock. And if you can't move that increased buffer stock, you will actually see a demand drop in the future, leaving your upstream suppliers with bigger inventories that they can't move. So you've actually caused a financial problem upstream by creating a buffer for yourself. And
Mm-hmm.
that leads to greater volatility. We can also see, for instance, a need to understand that pricing is actually something that must be dealt with quite strategically and holistically. One node within a network changing their pricing can actually lead to network fragility,
Yeah.
okay? Because it pushes pressures elsewhere. So what appears to be a sensible decision by an enterprise actually leads to the displacement of risk. And it's not just necessarily a straight line displacement of risk. It can actually displace risk onto a more vulnerable part of the network. And if you do that, again, it could cause network failure. Network failure in an environment of global supply chain risks is actually what you've got to be mitigating against.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Not just individual firm survival, because your survival as an individual firm is conditional upon your network survival and your network's competitiveness.
Right.
Right? So we need to build from traditional information strategies, but actually take a much more holistic view. AI enables us to
Mm-hmm.
actually begin to understand complex systems, right?
Yeah.
Now, complex systems as a way of thinking has been around for a long time.
Hmm.
The problem historically has been lack of data
Yeah.
and insufficient computational capacity to deal with complex systems and feedback loops.
Hmm.
But now we're able to do that.
Right.
AI is an important tool that can enable us to do that. We know, of course, that AI can just make some things faster anyway. Okay.
Right.
But we also know that AI comes with a whole range of risks because without proper subject matter knowledge,
Mm-hmm.
no one really knows whether the outputs of AI are appropriate or not. And so for the time being, a dependence on AI opens up new forms of risks, useful tool, but also one that actors need to be sensitive to ongoing risks, whether it's hallucination risks, whether it's literally making data up risks, or getting the calculations wrong, right? AI, in and of itself, we know, has not reached a level of performance
Yeah.
certainty that humans can simply walk away from. So subject matter knowledge and expertise remains central to how we use AI within these environments.
Absolutely agreed. So, Mr. Warwick, what I will do is I will summarize today's discussion and then we're going to jump on some questions that are coming in from the audience quickly. So, just to summarize, one message stands out clearly that the supply chain resilience is no longer optional, it's strategic. And the volatility driven by the geopolitics, trade shifts, logistical disruptions, this is here to stay. And resilience will be defined by visibility, intelligence, and speed of decision making. Today, we have explored how the global risk map is changing, how SMEs can reposition themselves in this evolving value chains, why deep tier data visibility matters, and how the trade intelligence and AI will shape resilient supply chains by 2026. The platforms, the trade intelligence reports that Market Insight provides, this helps organizations to move from reacting to disruptions by anticipating it, by enabling reliable buyer discovery, supplier validation, market opportunity identification, and competitor tracking. Okay, so
Yep.
we will quickly take a couple of questions from the
Yeah.
audience. Okay, if you are fine with it.
I'm fine. I can see the questions that have come through. So
Okay.
if you had to give one piece of advice to a handmade business owner preparing for 2026, what would you say they should fix first in their supply chain? Well, I think the first thing they need to do is map their supply chain, understand their supply chain in detail, through tiers one, two, and three, and even further. They need to be able to map materials, finance, and information flows, and they need to start to understand who their partners are in that supply chain system, because without understanding that, you're never going to be able to ensure supply chain resilience as a whole. So
Mhm.
that's the answer to that one. The other one is, do you expect some positive changes in the relationship between South Asian and East Asian countries post-Trump Greenland EU tensions? Furthermore, how do you read Carney's speech at WEF? Thanks. So there are two questions there. Look, Carney's speech, I've commented on it publicly on a number of occasions over the last 24 hours. In effect, it was a speech that seeks three things. One was, well, it was a confession,
Mhm.
firstly. Pleading for redemption, was also what that speech was about. And it was also an obituary. It was an obituary to the so-called liberal international order.
Mhm.
And the reason why I say it's a request for redemption is because Carney also acknowledged that Canada was a substantial beneficiary of what he, in fact, has said was fundamentally a lie. Okay, so he is, in some senses, seeking redemption. Whether or not he can follow through with substantive actions that are going to contribute to a new settlement, I think time will tell. He obviously went to Beijing before he made those remarks at Davos, and in that sense laid the groundwork for the shift. He can't be accused of just talk because he obviously put actions in place prior to um, articulating this obituary of the global international order,
Mhm.
rules-based international order. Look, I do think that South Asian nations and East Asian nations can continue to improve their relationships. Sometimes there are challenges, and almost all challenges, incidentally, have a historical shadow.
Yeah.
Historical shadows, of course, are difficult things to deal with because they often go to, the heart of national identity, emotions, and those sorts of things. But good leadership
Mhm.
can contain those emotional aspects of relationships, and they're important, but they can contain them in a way that does not disrupt other interests being advanced. So, South Asian nations do have an interest in the stability of East Asia as well, and vice versa. And stability comes from solid economic foundations, right? instability is amplified when countries are facing economic challenges, because economic challenges amplify through the social and political systems into political crises on the home front. So nations in South Asia and also nations in Southeast Asia have a lot of good reasons to work hard to consolidate their working relationships and to deepen their economic collaborations to the extent that they can through mutual standards, participation in increased trade, increased foreign direct investment, technology exchange, knowledge exchange, and people exchange. Um, I'm happy to do one more question if you'd
Yeah, so I
like.
think, I think we can take Sachin's question. This sounds interesting to me. What solution you would
Okay.
see in 2026? Because he's
Yep.
saying that you talked about semiconductors and other commodities hit.
Sure. Yep.
Yeah.
Here we go. Great. Okay. I've gotten to it. Other commodities take a hit. Tariff scenario solutions. Would you see that the United States, Asian countries should come as trade talk continues to ease off the tariff wars after all supplies? Okay. Look, there are many. There are a couple of things to understand about the tariff wars. Firstly, the tariffs that have been announced actually had no rhyme or reason, no economic reasoning.
Hmm.
And we know this because the original tariffs that were announced on Liberation Day, 2nd of April last year, were shown to be essentially a back of envelope spreadsheet extrapolation. They weren't based on country specific or sector specific analytics at all. We know that those tariffs ultimately were entirely capricious because they were changed left, right, and centre as discussions unfolded over the subsequent months. Again, no fundamental economic rationale underpinning them. The third thing we
Yeah.
can say about the tariffs is that they actually did not come into full effect. Most of the tariffs that were announced as headline tariffs have actually never seen the light of day because of the exemptions that were actually announced quietly along the way. So there are
Hmm.
numerous categories of things that are actually exempted from the headline tariffs that were announced. Now, what has been the implications of the the tariffs? Because what tariffs do is that they fundamentally affect the relative pricing of goods originating from different countries. That's the aim of tariffs. The secondary aim, as a consequence of that, is to try to incentivize the relocation of production activity to the place running the tariff regime. So Donald Trump sought to change the spatial distribution of trade globally, and he also sought
Yeah.
to cause a dramatic relocation of production activity to the United States. On that second front, nothing of note has happened yet. Manufacturing employment has actually fallen over the course of the last 10 months. And whilst there have been big announcements made about future investment and all those sorts of things, such as TSMC's commitment to build formal fabs, um, announcements are easy to make. Execution is hard and takes time.
Yeah.
And I think we're going to need to wait and see whether any of this materializes. In terms of um, uh, again solutions, countries are doing a few things already. The first thing they're doing is actually committing to multilateral and bilateral trade agreements that either were in place or which they have now put into place.
Hmm.
So instead of abandoning multilateral trade, what countries have done is consolidate multiple layers of multilateral trading relationships.
Yeah.
So that's the first thing that countries have done, because what they're realizing is that if the United States market is going to be a problem, then they're going to need to ensure that they have a rules-based, in a genuine sense, arrangement with other markets. Okay, and that's in everybody's interests, particularly countries that engage in a lot of trade. And countries that need technologies to upgrade their skills and upgrade their industrial base need to engage in trade. So anybody interested in economic development of their own economies needs to have a way of engaging in trade. So countries are finding new markets
Hmm.
We see that in the data. You will
Yeah.
see that in the trade data flows, right?
Right.
That yes, there is some rerouting, right? So instead of China, United States trade flows, some things are being rerouted. But the data will also tell you that it's not 100% being rerouted.
Absolutely.
Literally, there is a substantial drop in the amount of goods made in China arriving in the United States. But the trade amongst other countries,
Hmm.
including with China, but also South trade generally, is growing at a faster rate
Yeah.
than global trade growth. Right. So countries are building and consolidating new and old multilateral institutions and driving more trade growth. Okay. So I don't think Trump's tariffs have actually destroyed the global trading order. What they've done is propelled countries and forced countries to, in a sense, accelerate the evolution of a more multipolar globalization 2.0. Um, so countries need to just focus on that.
Yeah.
At some point, the United States will change its
Hmm.
flavor, if you will. We have seen that China pushed back very, very hard, and the
Yeah.
United States ultimately had to come to the party in the face of realities, by
Hmm.
which I mean the reality of physical constraints in supply chains, right? When people say that China has the cards, that's because China makes the cards and the United
Hmm.
States recognizes that. That's not to say that they're happy, but that's the reality of what's happened. And so countries need to understand that they need to diversify their relationships,
Yeah.
which is exactly what's happening. They need to actually mitigate the risks that they have to capricious national actors. And right now, if you want to say that there is one standout country as an unreliable trading partner, I would say it's the United States. And the
Hmm. Right.
reason it's unreliable is because the administration conducts public policy in a capricious way. It
Hmm.
makes things up as it goes. And it clearly does things as an emotional response to circumstance.
Yeah.
That is not conducive to the kinds of stability that enterprises and supply chains actually need
Neat.
to go
Right.
about doing their business, right? So, um, uh, Trump's tariff wars will continue. Um,
Hmm.
Politically, there's no way that he can walk back from them. He will ensure that there's numerous exemptions, particularly in a midterm election year. In the meantime, in answer to Sachin's question, diversify, 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 build stronger South-South trade links in Southeast Asia and South Asia, cultivate new trading relationships, focus on building data standards, right? Address digital trade issues
Yeah.
that remain outstanding. I would also suggest to my Indian friends that India needs to rethink
Hmm.
its relationship to the RCEP, the free trade agreement
Hmm.
between China, Japan, Korea, and ASEAN, Australia, New Zealand.
Yeah.
Now, India was part and parcel of all of those discussions and
Hmm.
was going to sign onto that program, but pulled out at the last minute. Now, I understand why countries can sometimes be reluctant because there are domestic winners and losers, okay?
Hmm.
And making sure that domestic losers in particular are compensated and adjustments are made and the distributional effects are not devastating is an important part of national security and the responsibility of governments. But I think it's been 4 or 5 years since RCEP came into existence. And I think India is in a position, given the knowledge and information that it has, because it was involved in all the negotiations, to
Hmm.
revisit this issue of becoming part of a regional open trading platform. So they're the things that I'd suggest countries and enterprises and supply chains need to do.
Perfect. So it's time to close, Professor Warwick. But before we close, I would really like to sincerely thank you for sharing your insights. Yeah,
Thank you
please
very
take care
much.
of yourself. Yeah, thank you. Bye bye.
Okay, bye bye.